I wanted to do a sort of deep dive into our garden style product. Um, we have videos on how we set these things up in Revit, and we do or will have videos on how we do technical items like how we actually build the matrices in Excel. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the package itself and maybe kind of explain a couple things that might not necessarily be clear when you look at it, highlight some important topics, and then talk about things that I see that get missed frequently. So let's just sort of wade into it. Starting with the cover working into the package, we in the garden style group use sheet size E1. That's a 30 by 42 sheet size. The reason that we use that particular size of sheet is that it just so happens to fit 2 garden styles per floor plan really well. As you can see demonstrated here, I get 2 floor plans per sheet, so there's an efficiency that we gain from that. Moving in, this top left, this information gets built into Excel. It's very important that we copy this fastidiously, that we are correct in these numbers, because these numbers are what the developer / owner will use to build their leasing tables, their pro forma off of. So it's very important that we get these numbers correct. We have 2 different kinds of these schedules. One of these is like you see here. This is pretty typical for us. We do the buildings by type alphabetically, and then correspondingly we do, for this one we have 3 different types, A, B, and C. When we get to the site plan, the site buildings will be numbered numerically, so you can have buildings 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on, and then you can have building type A, B, C, D. It's important when we kick off the job to make sure that the civil engineer is numbering the buildings as opposed to alphabetizing the buildings, because it can be very confusing when we have a building type A, building number A. It seems obvious. From there, we get into the definitions portion of the table. And again, how these tables work, the math behind them, we're going to do a separate video on how the Excel gets formulated or tabulated or calculated. We're just not going to crack open the Excel today. But suffice to say, the Excel table is set up in a very specific way so that it hopefully cuts down on the number of potential errors that you could have. So several Excel tabs are linked into one another. I do not want to see those links broken. We want to keep those links intact. Okay. Back to what we were talking about, definitions. We define what we call a, so to give you a little bit of code history on this. Units R2, multifamily units, 3 stories. We're in 4 stories and 2 stories. That's all sort of governed potentially by a multiplicity of building codes, but the ones that we lean on the hardest, the ones we use the most, it's the ANSI 117.1a definitions code book. Okay, and that is something that's linked from the International Building Code, and it's a book produced and curated by the International Code Council, so ICC. The International Code Council makes your International Building Code, your National Plumbing Code, Fire Code, all those books, they all kind of go together. There's also, folks see ADA a lot, you know, the 2010 ADA, and the 2010 ADA does have section 809 for accessible units. Those usually, that section and then the 5% versus the 2% come into play when you have a Title II funded job, HUD job, Kentucky Housing Corporation job. But we always try to do 5% for accessible units across the board. Also, ANSI has definitions for their accessible units. ANSI has an accessible unit, a Type A unit, a Type B unit, and a Type C unit, and a hearing visual unit. But because sometimes we're governed by FHAG, well, always governed by Fair Housing, FHAG, and ANSI, and sometimes but not limited to ADA, we just use accessible units as a generic term. But where the rules of that accessible unit are coming from ANSI, and they're specifically coming from the ANSI Type A rules. So one interesting point, like let's say you did hotels, right? That a hotel has a true ANSI accessible unit, whereas for us we have just ANSI Type A units. We also have ANSI Type B units, and ANSI Type B units are basically all ground floor units unless I tell you or the code tells you otherwise. There are some rules that basically say that given a very steep or very slopey site, you're allowed to reduce the number of Type B units, but we rarely do that. Moving on, gross square footage. This is, we define, so there are a couple different ways you can define gross square footage, and there are a lot of different ways you can define net rentable area or net rentable square footage. But when we're calculating it, just keep in mind that the way you define it based on these definitions needs to be the same as how you calculate it. I see sometimes people making the mistake of calculating, for example, the net rentable area in a way that is different than how they're defining it on these definitions, and then that can get you into trouble for obvious reasons. Especially if you promise more net rentable area than is actually in the unit. There's plenty of examples online where you can go see architects or developers or both being sued because the unit ends up being smaller than what they promised the tenant. So take care. From there, we tabulate the total net rentable area of all the units, the gross square footage of all the buildings, do any accessory buildings, and then your total gross square footage for the site. We count the total number of units on the job. We count the number of accessible units that we're going to provide. We always round up. We typically round up, even like when it's 1.2, we go to 2. A lot of local jurisdictions will allow you to round down. But what I've found is actually the banks, the lenders, who check all this stuff insist that we round up. So I've basically quit fighting it. We do these garden styles all over the country, and because we do them all over the country, it's just easier to sort of, unless it's ridiculously expensive, and these really aren't, they rent out just the same, that it's easier just to round up and give them what they want. Total number of buildings, and then building information. So per job or by job, one of the things I just don't see filled out very often is the construction type, and especially the median height. But the median height is very important. We'll kind of get to that. We'll see that on the exterior elevations here in a bit. Again, for this dive, I'm not getting into the differences between sprinkler systems and when you need them. That's kind of a separate code review process. But suffice to say that we do need to have that information. Moving down, governing codes with local amendments. This usually comes from the authority having jurisdiction, also known as the AHJ. Usually it's governed by kind of the local city or county that you're in. It's very rare that the state will actually determine what codes you're supposed to follow. But what I see here often is the abbreviation doesn't match the code for whatever reason, or that people just blatantly put the wrong codes. For example, in this particular instance, we are not doing any buildings to the Kentucky Residential Code. That just doesn't exist. We do them, your buildings are either to the International Building Code or to the Residential Code. Now sometimes you might have a job where you do houses, I guess, single family homes, or maybe townhomes, and then both would apply. But I know for a fact that this all just has 3-story buildings and a commercial clubhouse, so no, that's just flat wrong on this one. The abbreviations for this one do look right. IFC, you know, IPC, that's nice. This is the fair housing I was referring to earlier. This is the ANSI code I was referring to. Here's another good one. I have no idea what the plumbing has to do with an accessibility code. It's just flat out wrong. This is another good one. I like to, when you do a QAP, Qualified Allocation Plan, they have a list of what year the codes are. So I like it if they add the year that you are applying, you know, that you are complying with. So a year down the road, when I'm out there in the field, I know, okay, this person theoretically designed this job to that year of that code. Like there'll be a 2022 KHC minimum design standard before too awful long, right? There's our deferred submittal items. These are basically the items that are not done by us. We do not do radon control. We don't do pool drawings. We don't do signage. We don't do fire system drawings or irrigation. All that the GC hires or the owner or both. But it's not for us to sort out. Okay, moving on. This is our general information page, our general requirements page. I try to give this on here as an out of the gate thing for the contractor, and I'm trying to give them a little bit of help, a little bit of reading, so that they know a little bit more about what we're trying to do. Sometimes the drawings will show things, but we're not necessarily showing why we show things. So some of this will probably help them understand why, for example, I don't dimension doors that are in a 90-degree corner, right? And we'll touch on dimensioning here in a bit. But I just put this little diagram and it saves me hours of having to dimension doors, right? General requirements for providing stud guards so you don't put screws through pipes. Explaining a little bit about the underwriter laboratory, the UL assemblies, fire rating requirements, accessibility requirements, kind of doing a deep dive into blocking, what's required to be operable parts in a type A unit versus a type B unit, which we touched on previously. A little bit of exterior requirements, talking about how, and this is another ANSI type B, that any kind of 18-inch clear from the center line to the toilet to kind of any protruding edge. You know, toilet paper roll doesn't count, but pretty much everything else does. Talking about rated drywall must be installed behind fixtures, you know, when it's a rated wall. Energy requirements, foundation requirements, anything I can help the contractor and you know, you guys as well who are trying to draw these things. Yeah, I would recommend you read both of these things. And I update this list periodically, and this list kind of sits in the garden style library, which we can show you where that is. If you don't know, just ask one of your colleagues, they'll show it to you. All right, life safety. This is a diagram that gets reinforced with details in the sections and details pages that tells you what fire ratings you need for a building, for the walls, and tells you where to put fire extinguishers, and it tells you, and it talks about travel distances. Okay. things, there's a lot here, and I don't know if I want to go into each and every single detail on the page, but let's talk about one of the things that gets missed a lot. One of the things that is not very well understood, I think, or gets missed the most, is that the breezeway walls, the stairwell walls, this one and this one for all these buildings, varies depending on what jurisdiction you're in. So what do I mean by that? I mean that breezeways aren't very well defined. So some people believe, based on their interpretation of the code, that these are interior stairways. And when you have an interior stair, you're supposed to build it as basically a fire barrier, versus this particular job where they view it kind of more as an interior corridor that just so happens to have stairs in it, and then they allow us to build it kind of as fire partitions. And even from there, some people want to see a fire partition where it's rated from both sides, where some folks want to see it where it's rated from the inside only. The key factor here, the thing that's super important, is whatever we say in the life safety plans, whatever we define it as. And this particular individual is defining it as U356 rated from inside only. Okay, that whatever we say here, we also want to reinforce what we're saying here in the 400 series sections and in the 500 series details. That is by far and away the most missed and misunderstood thing in the garden style package, I think, with almost without question, almost without any other equal, I suppose I should say. And we again, in the garden style library, which I touched on already, we have an Excel spreadsheet that we build. So when we go into a jurisdiction, we learn what they want, we put in there how we want it to be in there. And I don't even expect people to understand how to build it differently. You know, we can definitely provide examples on how to build a fire partition, fire barrier, rated from one side, rated from both sides, or even a firewall down the road. We'll get to that all. But whatever it is you say it is here, it just needs to, if it starts that way in the life safety, it needs to finish that way in the 500 and 600 series details. So always be looking for that. Always try to double check that if you can. Another exceedingly misunderstood thing, it has to do with travel distance versus common path. And I think the easiest way I can explain it is if you end up in a bottleneck situation. If you ever bottleneck people where they no longer have, they only have one way out. It's at that bottleneck that the common path of travel starts or stops, depending on how you want to think about it, right? So let's look at this unit, for example, right? There are many different paths that you could take, and no, you can't jump off the third floor balcony. I know what you're thinking. On the first floor, yeah, that would be true, but we're looking at an upper floor. The point being, there are many paths of travel that you could take to get out of this unit, but you can see they all come to one door, one bottleneck. That's called common path of travel, and you are only allowed by building code to go X distance when you only have one way out. That is for us shown in a blue line, as you can see here in labeled common path. Once you go through that bottleneck, and then you have the option to either go to this stair or this stair, aka you have choices on which way you can flee a burning building, then it just becomes exit travel distance. Exit travel distance is allowed to be a whole lot longer than common path. That's just common sense, right? And let me be clear here too. Let's say I have a corridor building that has a stair here and a stair here and a hallway down the middle of it. The egress path is from the equidistant point here in the middle. So if this is 100 feet and this is 100 feet, then the egress travel distance would be 100 feet from this point. I don't have to consider bizarre situations like this where, you know, this is 150 feet and this would be 50 feet. You get to, once you get to egress travel distance, you get to count egress travel distance from the equidistant point between those two egress points, aka stairs, on a given floor. And it is per floor unless it's common travel path. One other thing that I see people miss all the time is not adding the common path to the total travel distance. So, for example, if these are units here, right? Unit, 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 so on and so forth. That you also have to add the common path to the exit travel distance when you're looking at a given floor. Just food for thought. You can't do this and then this separately. They're quantitative. They add together. Okay. Other small things I see missed, make sure that we double check these rules, these life safety notes based on a particular job. There are some small instances where they can change. Sometimes I see the hatches missing. You know, again, these values, by the way, are also tied into a different page of this Excel. So if you fill this out in one area correctly, you'll have this information. Just FYI. Other little silly things I see missed. So stairway width for this one, right, is 144 inches. That is a derivative of 36 times 4, which is per floor 1, 2, 3, 4 stairs all added together, 36, 36, 36, 36. If you have, say, for instance, a 12 unit building as opposed to a 24, it'll be half that, right? Or if you've got, for example, a 36 unit building, the total stair width again would be different. Okay. Moving on, other life safety items. This is something that I see often in Kentucky. They want to see the garages. They want at least one fire barrier, and the rest of these can be fire partitions. That's something that will help you. It's an easy way to, you know, if you go look at one of these jobs, it's an easy way to understand the difference between fire partition and fire barrier. Fire partition goes typically to the underside of the roof deck versus the fire partitions, which just stop at the ceiling. Okay, life safety for the clubhouse. They've done a good job of getting a fire extinguisher. One inside of a cabinet in the kitchen, which is always a great idea, and then one that's sort of in the middle of the building that's easy to go grab as needed. They got a lot of their common paths shown. They've got travel distances shown. This looks pretty good. Minor things I would have shown that this also is an egress door. But other than that, it looks pretty good. Again, tabulating just a little bit of math. Total egress width. You're good to go. Sometimes on these clubhouses, the only thing I see, there are certain jurisdictions they want us to rate the mechanical room as a 1 hour wall, and then always if there's a laundry room, they want us to rate the laundry room sometimes as a fire partition, sometimes as a fire barrier. All right, wall partition schedules. So the wall partition schedule should probably just be called assembly schedule, because it technically covers wall partitions, wall, roof, floor, and a bunch of, shaft walls and a bunch of other stuff besides, right? So luck for us in the garden style package, I do know, for example, like in the more complicated building packages, this gets a lot more robust. But for us, obviously, we kind of have our 1 through 7 wall partition tags. Sometimes we might hit a dozen wall partitions, but we rarely do here. So we just try to keep it really, really simple. So why do we have this sheet? Well, this sheet kind of covers us for a lot of assembly information, so we don't have to say it multiple times. For example, we do our exterior partitions and we kind of delineate interior breezeway versus just regular exterior. Again, the interior breezeway, exterior partition type 2, we have that pulled out as a separate piece for the same reasons we talked about earlier in the life safety sheets. Based on the jurisdiction, it could be assembled differently and have a different fire rating requirement. So we do the exterior partitions first, and we just try to get out a lot of basic information that gets sort of reiterated. Either gets reiterated in the wall sections in the 500 series details, or just gets said here so we don't have to say it once we get to the 400 or 500 series details, right? So we're reinforcing what we want the contractor to do. The second part of this, the interior partitions, because we don't have wall sections through the interiors almost at all, this is how this basically helps the contractor know how to build or how to assemble the interior partitions, so we don't have to have a bunch of wall sections through them. The floors and the ceiling kind of go back to the exterior walls. It's just a reinforcement of what we already do. So let's kind of dig into a little bit of what I see missed or incorrect when we do these things. Again, this is your wall partition tag. You'll see these later. These are put on the floor plans and the enlarged unit plans so that so the contractor knows kind of how to build the wall, right? Here's our simple diagram explaining how it works. Here we go. Exterior partitions. This one usually is done correctly. The only thing that I see missed sometimes is if the building changes from having a stone veneer to a brick veneer. People show the stone here and say stone. That needs to be updated based on your exterior materials. Exterior partition 2, the breezeway versus interior. Again, what gets missed consistently potentially is not correctly coordinating with what you just said in the life safety sheets. This is just a placeholder from when we got exterior materials on both sides of the wall. It's sort of used for 1% of the whole job. These are our demising walls. This separates, they're called demising walls, they separate units from each other. The reason we like this one, the reason it's a double wall, is explicit. It's for sound. It works great for structural as well, but our main reason we love it is that it's really, really good for sound. Keeps it quiet between you and your neighbors. It gets a sound transmission class, STC rating of almost 58 or 60, depending on which one that you're using. 5, standard 1 hour rated wall, standard non-rated wall, standard non-rated wall with drywall only on one side. These are kind of our plumbing walls, potentially sort of furring walls behind tubs. Here is our standard roof assembly, and here is our standard floor assembly with our 20-inch deep trusses. Things that get missed a lot, things I see wrong on these are not including, or at least not trying to include, for example, saying the R value of the insulation as opposed to pointing to the Rescheck con check. What are the Reschecks and con checks? Well, they are your energy checks, and you run these energy checks to sort of prove out or figure out what R value, or in the case of the windows, the U value, which is just an inverse of R, that you need to pass the energy code in a given jurisdiction or a given area. Okay. The other thing that people see are the UL assemblies. These are underwriter laboratory assemblies. These assemblies that you see here. Someone's put them in a laboratory, big laboratory, built them, and then basically put a very large blowtorch to them and tested them to see how well they perform under fire. And if they pass, they get a UL assembly designation that basically just shows people how to build a particular wall, that it must meet a certain particular grouping of standards. And then architects and engineers reference those underwriter laboratory assemblies, so we know that when the contractor builds it, that wall is going to perform with a certain fire rating. All right. Getting into that, we also provide the underwriter laboratory ULs and the designations that we're using, so that the contractor can see what underwriter laboratory we're using, number one, and see as well the number of systems that UL offers. What do I mean by that? It's kind of like a Hardy Boys Choose Your Own Adventure book for the contractor. They can pick any one of the systems within this underwriter laboratory or series of systems. They make a series of selections to comply with that UL designation. We don't typically tell them which path they need to take, just so long as they comply with the underwriter laboratory assembly. If that okay. To say this a different way, so like I need the underwriter laboratory, if you read all this out, it'll say you have to comply with either system 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. So they pick, well, okay, I want to use system number 11. Then they comply with system number 11. They're good to go. Here is, and by the way, you'll notice there's a lot of text on this stuff. All that text is really important. So you'll see I do these underwriter laboratory assemblies. We're getting away from this, but I usually had these labeled. Instead of UL assemblies, I had this one labeled floor, UL floor assembly. This one was roof assembly. The reason that there's like one UL per page is so that they're easy to read. They're very important information that the contractor needs to be able to do his job correctly. And one thing that I see a lot of time, people like dismiss the UL assemblies, or they just put them in, but they put the font so unbelievably small that no one could possibly read it, and then just leave it up to the contractor to go download the latest version, or they just have some version that's from like 2010, as opposed to periodically updating and checking these underwriter laboratories to make sure we're using the most current version of these underwriter laboratory assemblies. That to me is a big mistake. The drawings are in the order that they're in because the most important information in my mind typically comes first. So don't shy away from these things. Make sure that you got them in there correctly. Make sure that they are legible, that they can be read, and make sure that we're trying to do our best to label these sheets correctly, so that you are clearly communicating to the contractor what's in it and what you want them to build. We also do, underwriter laboratories has a lot of what I call penetration details for when plumbing, mechanical, ductwork penetrates one of these rated assemblies. You have to do it in a very specific way, and that's where those details come from. Moving on, we have our Reschecks and Comchecks. We do these by building type. Okay, so type A gets a Rescheck, B gets a Rescheck. Then comes the question, when do I need, what's the difference between a Comcheck and a Rescheck? Well, a Rescheck is something that you are allowed to do for any building that's 3 stories or less in multifamily, and is typically less strict than a Comcheck. Com standing for commercial building. I want to make it plain, and this is where people get confused. They see res check and they think residential, and then they start to think that these buildings are governed by the residential code. They are not governed by the residential code. We're governed by the commercial code, the International Building Code. But again, when it comes to the energy code, the IECC, they allow you to do 3 stories or less is allowed to have a, residential is allowed to have a res check. When you do a res check, okay, things that I see missed a lot is either not really understanding kind of the assemblies that you are using. And I see people not going through and doing the mechanical and envelope checklist that are a part of those res checks. Again, I've done a deep dive on how you do a res check and how you do a com check, so you can watch those videos separately to this. But suffice to say that, we want to make sure that we're doing them correctly, obviously, that we're labeling what job they're for, who's the designer, making sure that we have the right energy code year, and this is true for either res check or com check. And then making sure that the values that we're putting in here, the areas, are accurate and make sense. Okay. And then, of course, another thing I see is making sure you pass. This one, for example, compliance passing with kind of 2.7% better than code. That's good. That's sweet spot. That's right where we want to be. Here is probably more res checks for more building types, and then here is the com check. Again, the clubhouse is a commercial building, so it would need a commercial com check review. I do believe technically that the maintenance building would also, or should also, because it's an occupied structure, theoretically have a com check as well. The car wash, because it's not really an occupied building, it's not heated, it's not cooled, it's not conditioned, that it doesn't require a res check or a com check. It doesn't really, there's no energy to potentially be wasted, so there's no envelope that needs to be checked to make sure we're not wasting energy that we're not using. Alrighty, site plans. We do two site plans for garden style. We do a traditional site plan. This one, based on the latest civil plan that we received. There's only two things, really, 2 or 3 things that we're doing with this A100 site plan. We're potentially going to put a north arrow on it because the client likes to see that. Personally, I could give a toss, but there you are then. We just want to do that. And the other thing that clients want to see, because these buildings are symmetrical in every way except for the fire riser rooms and the flat roofs, we need the client to approve the facing direction of the flat roof areas. So we do the site plan, we take a guess as to which way that we think that the flat roof should face. And by the way, the flat roofs are the unappealing side of the buildings. They don't look nearly as good. It's just some ugly guardrail up there. So we try to orient that in a way that the client agrees with for every single job. Some clients believe that they want to be nice neighbors, for example, so these all face internally so that their neighbors across the way don't have to look at that they're condensing units, versus the some clients that want their property to kind of have a nice courtyard area so they face them towards their neighbors. That's a decision I typically leave up to the owner. Okay. So if we have to have a situation where we have a situation, right, where we're showing the flat roof areas, which the civil usually does not do, so that's, something that's left up to us, then we have to have another site plan, and this shows our accessible units and our sensory units. Because we build our buildings by type, I could have 10 different type A's, but I don't need 10, let's say I don't need, for example, not every type A unit or type A building is going to have a accessible type A unit inside of it. So to map those out for the contractor, we provide a map of where we want the accessible units to go. Because for long reasons that I'm not going to get into here, because I want to see a sidewalk to each side of the breezeway for a accessible unit, when you do these maps, I like to see the accessible units clustered together in groups. So this is a good example. This breezeway gets 1, 2. So I'm maximizing the fact that this breezeway has 2 sidewalks out of it that both need to be accessible, so I'm trying to pack them in there. I'd also try to, once you've met that criteria, I do try to spread the accessible units out across the site. I don't like to see accessible units all packed into one or two buildings. The optics on that are not good. So you want to avoid that wherever. It's just a last resort kind of thing. And I've never actually done it where I've tried to pack them all into one or two buildings. I try to equally give equivalency where we can. So they're spread out across the site. Okay? All right. The last thing about site plans that I should probably mention is that there's usually a coordination that needs to happen with site plans, like the day before we go to permit, the day before we go to construction set. I try to ask the civil engineer for the latest and greatest AutoCAD and update our AutoCAD to match what they have, so there's not a coordination issue. We've also been trying to have a big push to make sure the mirroring or orientation of our clubhouse in our floor plans matches the orientation on site. Other little things, make sure it's easy to read, that all the buildings are clearly labeled on the site. This one does an okay job of providing a decent label on the buildings, so that's good. Moving on, floor plans. Floor plans. So from here, this, obviously I don't want to spend, we're already 40 minutes into this video, I don't want to spend a hellacious amount of time on floor plans. Suffice to say that I want to make sure when we're doing it, that as you're creating a new job, that both of the applicable notes that we typically do for our typical floor plans shows up. And I want to make sure that all the unit labels, whatever the unit is, 3BR unit, 3BR1 unit, that the unit here exactly matches the label that you're putting here, right? So 3BR, 2BR, we want that. And, oh, we're missing a label. This label to be the same. Obviously, if they're not, it can be super confusing as to what in the world you're talking about. From there, it's nice to see call-out tags. Where do I go look for the stairs? Where do I go look on how to build the porches? Are my section tags called out? Do I have all my exterior elevations in the viewports? Are they easy to read, or are they sort of covered up or sort of in line with something else? You know, that's that level of drafting cleanliness. Do the title blocks line up? Or are we at 1/8 of an inch? You know, 1/8 of an inch per foot scale. If not, why not? And then are the fire sprinkler rooms labeled? Does the door tag make sense? Does it not make sense? I don't know what Mountain Dew tag this is. I think they would probably just be fine with doing SPR for the door as well. 3 good dimension lines, opening, openings, then ins and outs for framing, frame to there, frame to there, frame to there, and then overall dimensions. Again, we've done dimensioning discussions. These look good. All right, roof plans. Roof plans can be exceedingly complicated, and people spend a lot of time learning how to do them, right? So this one is missing its vent area calculation labels, and it's just, I need to show, it's important to show and label these ventilation calculations. They need to provide enough intake air at the soffit or at the eave of the roof, and then they need to provide enough exhaust air at the peaks of the roof. We can do that with slant back box vents, or box vents for short, and we can do that with ridge vents. It looks like they're handling it all with box vents here. They run a fairly simple calculation that I won't get into at this particular junction, but we need to label which area is which. So they've got two areas. They've got an area here over the 3-bedroom units, so they got 1, 2, 3, 4 of those, and then they've got 2 more areas, one here with the RTU, and then the one here divided up by the blue lines, which is draft stopping. That just prevents smoke and a little bit of fire from migrating in your attic space from one side of the attic to another. Things that I see missed a lot, providing, so for example, missing the ladder. They got an access hatch here and here. This one will be a pull down ladder. Then they have a door through the draft stopping. Then they have a door through a wall out onto the flat roof area for the condensing units, right? A little bit of guardrail. So much you can get into this, but the thing I just see things missed all the time on this, where it's, these are copy paste jobs, but people consistently don't label everything that we need to, and tag everything that we need to tag. They just tag some of it or most of it. And that's where kind of these, you get into problems. These guys, for instance, they're not showing the actual roofs. It might be a trimming issue. So, roof plans, roof detailing, kind of is its own area of expertise, and that they just take practice. But just the more you can fastidiously study one that's been done, the better off you'll be trying to reproduce one. More floor plans. Here is a typical clubhouse for us. Don't know if there's too much in here that typically causes us a lot of problems, other than sometimes I see that we're missing interior elevations for certain items. For this one, for example, I think we're missing an interior elevation of this toilet partition. So we need to add that. But this one looks pretty good. This one looks tagged fairly well. Got our doors, fireplaces sort of fairly well documented. Kitchen's good. They got dimensions and wall tags for this 2x6 wall. It's looking pretty good. Can't complain here. Things that I do see, this section, we need to at some point provide a section through here, kind of looking this way, or the other way even, just to help define how those entrances are supposed to be framed. But we'll get there. Roof plan for the clubhouse is similar to what we already talked about. I think in general this one just needs to be put in its viewport, but it's probably okay. Alright, interior, what is this? These are our enlarged unit plans. Enlarged unit plans, I think, are governed, in general, I try to keep people from messing with these too much. These, because they can just get you into so much trouble so fast, right? Because they are governed by a whole lot of ANSI Type B rules. And when it comes to the accessible units, the ANSI Type A rules. And because they are copied a million times, that if you don't have it right, then it can be extremely expensive and painful for the team to fix anything in here that's wrong. So in general, what I ask people usually when they're starting out to do is just don't touch them. And that's for everybody's well-being. Usually it's me personally coming in here and messing with the units. Lately, some of the folks on the team have gotten pretty good about handling these units without me, and that's been excellent. But even they're probably not at a place where they're designing new units yet, and we want to cautiously. Let's put it like this: it's so bad that I insist that Vadim not design units, and every time he tries, Tony and I shout at him. So yeah, that's where we're at with these units. I make no bones about it. Unless you can be intimately familiar with at least the ANSI Type B rules for units, and some of the other units, some of the other rules besides, it's probably not going to be healthy for you to try to design units until you understand the rules, right? What I do want to see is when people do the units, sometimes they get into issues where things that should be tagged are not tagged and they need to be tagged. A lot of interior elevations, maybe a couple of missing walls. The other thing that I see sometimes that, again, I'm trying to handle it personally so that you don't have to, that someone wouldn't have to do that, right, is missing the rough opening dimensions for bathtubs. So for example, here, it's just the dimension that we would want to have, right? Here it is, 210. 5. This one's also missing. Little things, little itty bitty dimensions that it's nice, if I can catch some of these things. I don't know why these particular dimensions that I'm showing right now, they have a tendency to just kind of disappear job to job, and they have to go back and be added in, and I don't know why. Here's another example of the door shouldn't be dimensioned, the wall should be dimensioned, and once you dimension the wall, the door becomes in a 90 degree, or it is in a 90 degree corner, and then the door's dimensions are not necessary. Oop, this one's backwards. There we go. Sometimes we get a little bit of carryover. If it's a market rate job, for example, LDG requires 50% step-in showers, so that's why we have 2 one-bedroom units that are the exact same unit in every way except for a step-in shower. Then we get 2-bedroom units that are on the ends of the buildings, and the only difference there is they get a window, kind of a second window in this bedroom, which is sort of just a nice to have. Here's our multi-car garages. Every job is a little bit different. Some jobs will have 12 car, 8 car, 7 car, 6 car. They're the same thing every time. We just end up modifying it to match civil. Here is that fire barrier wall we talked about in the life safety sheets, where you can see it going to the underside of the roof deck. Here's our typical trash enclosure. It's beautiful. Here's our market rate bar and grill. It's also beautiful. Here's some more sections of it that don't coordinate with the end walls for coping. I have a feeling these guys are probably going to actually have some sort of decorative end on them, as opposed to being chopped off rough lumber, I would hope. much like these would be on this end. I would want to have that same design here. But, you know, don't want to go crazy. Right. Here's some more bar and grill stuff. Then some more. Here's our maintenance shed. It comes with a window. Exterior elevations. Then these are pretty straightforward. Most of the design is not handled by you guys at this particular juncture. In fact, it's probably mostly not handled by me either. It's usually sort of delegated to us by the client. Issues that I see all the time, not providing the median roof height, which is just the average height between truss bearing and maximum roof height, and not providing enough detail callouts or detail tags, and or not calling out sort of specialty items like brackets, these little guys, these little pieces of wood, or these columns, or the handrail maybe, or trim around the door. It's usually something. That, and then there's always graphic clarity. It sort of wanders about, but usually I don't have people usually understand the exterior elevations without too much trouble, right? Same deal for the clubhouse. Oh, good. Door schedule. Things that get missed all the time. Door hardware specifications, right? The door hardware specifications for the unit doors are pretty straightforward. But the hardware, what number it gets, that's a derivative of what's in the door hardware specifications. It's in your spec book, basically. And folks, we try to keep it to be in the same numbers, so you should be able to copy the hardware specifications job to job without it changing at all, which is nice. I just see sometimes they get the door hardware, it's just not filled in, for example. That, or they just go crazy on what's supposed to be an aluminum door versus a solid core door. That, or they forget to do the maintenance building or the sprinkler room, or in this case the maintenance building and the sprinkler room, the door tag's wrong. That, you need to make sure that you are detailing and dimensioning your storefront doors. Make sure you're detailing and calling out all your door elevations and your windows. If you add a particular window, you got to add it here. Alright, manufacturer details. These kind of drop off from time to time, but we want to make sure you have your standard manufacturer details for the zip sheeting. If the job has Tyvek as opposed to zip, you need to swap this sheet out for Tyvek. Okay, wall sections. These are fun. So wall sections should be the intent here that I try to get people kind of in the habit of is that wall sections should show the basic assembly graphically, and that we want to show a lot of dimensions for verticality. You do your X and Y plane on the floor plans for dimensions, and then your sections kind of cover your Z axis for dimensions, and then they just cover callouts, right? So how to build everything should be in the 500 series sheets, right? So I jump here, there's my typical porch, right? For example. Cool. I don't typically see a lot of things missed on the wall sections, other than people, I can get into problems when people just are trying to build new things as opposed to copy something that they can see existing. And that can get them into a bit of trouble. But other than that, they're usually not so bad. This sheet in general, when you're building complicated porches, it's really important and very helpful to build a series of details with a lot of good dimensions for where the structural column is, and then the furring, the decorative wrap around the column that you want to create. it's really important that, you know, you provide a lot of good dimensions for that. So this sheet does a nice job of covering that, showing you kind of how they do the arch, the radius of the arch. It's all fairly well documented. They even went so far as to provide a couple of isometric details, you know, just some views so you understand, the contractor can understand better what he's trying to build, which is really nice. Okay. Stair sections. Again, this goes back to what we talked about sort of in the beginning with life safety. I see a lot of times that people will miss or have incorrectly shown on this and then the 500 series details the fire rating for the breezeways, that it'll be different here than what we were saying in the life safety. I see that people will consistently miss that the stair riser count, you know, either they'll miss the fact that on the first floor there's an extra riser because the breezeway slopes, and they'll have 19 as opposed to 20, or they'll just leave this dimension for the number of risers off altogether, or they'll miss dimensioning the openings. Something about this very important section, one or more things seems to disappear job to job. But I think we've been better lately about making sure that everything that's supposed to be in this section is in this section, right? Which has been good. Apparently we needed 2 on this particular job, probably for a different building type, probably to show this dog return, to catch this 3rd floor door. Here's that clubhouse section. There's their fireplace. Here's where I was talking about needing a section looking the other way through this. We'll get there. 500 series details. I don't know if I want to say too much about this in this particular lecture, other than to say things should be tagged correctly. Here's a good example. This 7KK actually should point to this insulation dam that we show here, as opposed to the insulation. But it's really close, so we'll kind of let that slide. Other things that I see that can be consistently wrong. Not calling out the insulation, saying it's supposed to be thick, certain thickness versus seeing the R value. This is another one. Missing the note altogether for how you protect that sucker. Yep. In general, this looks pretty good though. Can't complain too much about these. I get a lot of variety. Again, the only real problem I get is when people don't necessarily understand the order of things. So here, this is kind of a hard concept to explain, but to do this well, right? So people ask me why we go in the order that we go in for these wall sections and these details. And I will tell you that the thing right out of the gate that I like to see, wall section number 1, I want to see this to be what I call the most typical wall section, the most simplistic, typical baseline wall section that we build. Everything beyond this wall section, like from number 1, for example, the fire riser room is just a copy of whatever number 1 is with additional stuff stuck to it. Number 3 is a copy of number 1 with a porch stuck to it, right? And so on and so on and so on. Number 5 is a copy of wall section 1 with the roof showing the flat roof area, which is, it's exactly the same except for a slightly longer eave in this particular instance, right? And that's the way you should think about building sections. If you have an entirely new job, you want to start with what's the most simple thing that I have, and then I want to build from there. The same will or should be true for the 500 series. Building on that, right? That detail number one, how do I build my typical foundation? How do I build my typical floor? How do I build my typical roof? 1, 2, 3. Easy to find, easy to read, easy to navigate. And that once you understand correctly how you want to build your typical assembly, everything from there is a extrapolation or builds upon that basic piece of information. So if you see something that's not in that order, fix it, or let me know, or both, or be ready to defend why it's not in that order. You want these things to be easy for everybody involved in to read and to use. Here's some more. A lot of weird organization here. I would prefer this be kind of cleaned up and lined up, but it's not bad. Here is this is kind of what I call our standard details page, right? It has a lot of the general information that that the contractor would normally use or need, like how to do draft stopping, for example, what draft stopping could be made out of, how to do our standard flat roof to slope roof transition, how to do our downspout ground transition, how to do our porch waterproofing, how to do our standard block detail for it's really not a dryer vent box, it's anything. It's lights, it's dryer vents, it's fresh air intakes, anything could provide. It's really, this is a mounting plate detail. That's sort of mislabeled. Guardrail detail. These breezeway details should probably be potentially on a different page, but it's alright. Here's our standard corner details. These are always copy pasted. The only changes that you would need to make is stone versus brick on the veneer, depending on the job. Here's our typical pier detail. The height of this, sometimes you have a pier on an exterior elevation that's not our standard 6 foot. You would just need to label it, but that's not the case here. Standard stair details. This is one where I like it, where they've shown both stairs on the 3rd floor that they can vary. Standard stair here has kind of got a little return, a little landing for that door, versus on a type B where it's not necessary because the door is not protruding down so far. Guardrail details, stair details, fabrication, basis of design details. And finally, that leads us to our interior elevation page. This kind of wrapping it up. This is, again, I think that I see the only real problem I have with this sheet is in general is failure to copy. If you can find a good precedent for this and copy it fastidiously, we shouldn't have any problems whatsoever. And I mean really fastidiously copy, right? Like, again, this one's a pretty good example of showing it's like they do tubs, then they do showers, then they do accessible tubs, accessible showers, and then they do standard vanities. I bet you the next page is going to be all kitchens, different kitchen islands. It's all very neat, very well organized. They provide the Assura shower cut sheet for the accessible shower that we always need to have. Just make sure you are copying it verbatim, and there will almost never be any problems with it. Literally everything I mark up is just somebody either doing bizarre cabinet layouts or just missing a whole bunch of really important notes. Here's kind of clubhouse, mailboxes, and then finally kind of our manufactured details. This is like, this is our basis of design for the, the column wraps and our wood brackets. Okay, I know this is not entirely inclusive of every single solitary thing that we do here, But hopefully this has been a good hour-long walk through our package of drawings. What I typically see that gets missed, and then maybe a little bit about why we do what we do. Hopefully this hasn't been too dry, and I really appreciate you guys' help with all these. As yeah, hopefully this has been useful. Thank you very much.